We will now begin a detailed study of the Cold War and how this historical period in U.S. history would affect Asian Americans in particular. So this is going to be quite an expansive topic. And by the way, here are some illustrations found on this slide of topics we will touch upon. Here's a picture of the boat people, as they were called, once they were fleeing Vietnam. They jammed all into this boat trying to flee the communist regime that took over by 1975, and many of them would wind up in the United States. Here's a photo of, actually a very famous photo, one of the most famous photographs in world history. This is a picture of the burning monk who set himself on fire in protest of an oppressive regime in South Vietnam, which the U.S. government supported, by the way. Here on the bottom left is the Immigration Act of 1965, and what this would do is eliminate racial categories from our immigration laws. Let's remember we had discussed the 1924 Immigration Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, and how there's this quota system called the National Origins Quota System that was inserted there that was very race-based. Well, the 1965 Immigration Act would finally eradicate those race-based categories in our laws. And then here we have a picture of some labor activists. Remember the Manongs, the Filipino farmers in the U.S. West? Well, they would begin to protest their conditions, their workplace and economic conditions, low pay and exploitation and what have you. They would actually join ranks with Latino agribusiness workers, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, being their leaders, and they would form this unified front to protest their conditions again. So this would happen during this period. Okay, so these are some of the topics that we will discuss here, as well as other topics that connect to Asian American history during the Cold War. All right, so before we engage with some more specific histories that connect to Asian American history, let's first dial back to the end of World War II in 1945 and discuss some crucial geopolitical shifts that occurred during this time as a result of the war. And of course, the Cold War, as you probably know, would emerge right after the end of World War II by 1947. So that's just 2 years after the end of World War II. We'll find ourselves in a new conflict, although, as I will describe, it's more of an ideological conflict. So again, you see the end of World War II, and on the European theater, you see the invasion of Germany by Allied forces, the USSR, the Russians, as well as United States and some English forces. Germany would surrender by May 1945, and then on the other side of the world, in the Pacific theater, you see the end of the Pacific War, especially with the dropping of the atomic bombs upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and August 9th, 1945. And with that, Japan would formally capitulate to the Allied forces. So both German and Japanese empires would be crushed by the United States and our allies, of course. Now, by the way, in the Pacific theater, the United States, once you see Japan surrendering formally, well, the U.S. would actually occupy Japan temporarily, of course. This would happen between 1945 and 1952, and it would be under the command of the leading military official in the U.S. military at that time, General Douglas MacArthur. You may have heard of his name. And, of course, Japan is very close to the USSR, to Russia, very close proximity to the eastern side of the USSR. So with the emergence of Cold War, um, 2 years after the surrender of Germany and Japan, well, you're going to see an escalation of tension, of course, not only in Asia, but really throughout the entire globe. But as you can imagine, our focus will be primarily on the Pacific side of this conflict when we are discussing some geopolitical issues as well as war, right? You may have, you're already familiar with the Vietnam War, probably, not to mention the Korean War. These wars occurred in the Pacific region, of course, and they are wars that were fought during the Cold War. Okay, now, in case you weren't aware, the United States and the USSR and China were allies during World War II. Yet, with the conclusion of the war, they now became enemies during the Cold War. By the way, the Cold War spans from, as I mentioned, 1947 through 1991, which is the year that the USSR collapsed, right? So what is the nature of this conflict? Okay, the United States and our allies versus the USSR and China and its various allies. What caused this division that would basically be the primary conflict that would occur through the rest of the 20th century? Okay, well, unlike the previous war, which was actually a hot war, okay, when it came to conflict between the United States and the USSR and China, well, it's more than just a clash of different empires, okay? As we know, the United States is indeed an empire. Needless to say, Soviet Union and China, you could certainly call them imperial. China, they would still today, right? They hold places in Tibet and other regions more to the western side. Okay, so they're all imperial formations here. But again, it's not just a clash of imperial rule that would occasion this conflict, all right? But it's actually more complicated. Indeed, much of this conflict can be summarized as a clash between competing political and economic ideologies, as stated in the slide here, right? The Cold War is a war of ideologies, two competing political economies. And, both sides, the United States and Russia and China, desired that their respective ideologies be globalized. That is to say, and we'll discuss this further, there was countless non-aligned or unaligned nations during the Cold War period. And you'll see this competition between both sides trying to attract these unaligned nations or non-aligned nations into the respective orbits, right? So they're competing, okay? You have two competing political economies. Okay, so we have to make sure what is behind this ideology. And it brings us to the distinction here, at least theoretically or conceptually, between capitalism as one political economy against that of socialism. Okay, so we're talking about capitalism versus socialism. Now, a central issue in this debate is largely economic. Okay, and it boils down to this question here. This is a central issue in this debate, as noted in the slide. Who owns or controls the, quote, means of production in that particular economy, whether it's socialist or capitalist? Okay, so this brings us to the question, what do you mean by means of production? Well, as again noted in the slide, means of production refers to the physical, or as scholars like to call it, material, okay, the material assets and resources necessary to produce goods and services in that economic system. Okay, so we're talking about physical assets, physical resources or material resources um, that are necessary. Example, private property, land, right? That's necessary to produce goods. Natural resources. You need factories. You need, similar type of infrastructure, factories and related infrastructure. Within the factories, you have machines oftentimes, right? You have tools, raw materials. And then how do you sell them? These various goods that are produced by the factory system. Well, you sell them in shops or stores. So even a giant mall, right? That is considered a means of production. Okay, so all that stuff, and I'm sure I could include more in what means of production includes. Well, that's very expansive, right? And by the way, the means of production doesn't just specifically relate to capitalism. Okay, you can talk about a means of production in pre-capitalist political economies. For example, in the feudal system, right, it's predominantly agrarian or agricultural. So what are the means of production, so to speak, in that economic system? Well, the soil, right, plows, shovels, right, even mules, right, beasts of burden, so to speak, right? So you can see how that compares with in the future with the industrial setting of factories and raw material and mines and factories. I just said that machines, right? So all that stuff. And again, I have to emphasize physical, and all those things I included as part of the means of production. I never mentioned human labor. Right? I never mentioned something that's social, a social relationship, like employee and employer, right? That was not mentioned. We're talking about material or physical resources and assets, okay? So that's what you have to exclude from means of production, any sort of human relation or human dimension in that economy. Okay, it's purely physical. Okay, so that's the means of production. So the question is, who owns it? And that's where you see both systems part company in their beliefs, in their ideology. And some of the stuff you're familiar with, right? Because we live in a capitalist society today, and it's something that's almost spoon-fed to us, right, in our education as, citizens in a capitalist political economy. So we're aware of things like, private industry, keyword private, right? Capitalism is a case where the means of production is owned privately. It's privately owned. That is to say, it's not owned by the public or the government or the state, however you want to put it. Okay, so when we say privately owned, we're referring to the fact that individuals own the means of production, or perhaps a group of individuals that you call a corporation, right, or a company, right? So individuals or corporations or companies, they own the means of production. So why is this state of affairs, that is to say private ownership, believed to be so crucial for capitalism? Why do they debate this issue to the point where they're willing to engage in this Cold War, right? Well, it's because of the belief, the central article of faith in capitalism, that individuals and corporations, they control the resources and they control the production. This leads, because of their desire or their thirst for profit, this leads to economic growth as opposed to being owned publicly or by the state or by the government, right? When individuals desire, that profit, well, that motivates economic activity, right? And this is, by the way, if you're familiar with Adam Smith, you may have heard of the term, the quote, hidden hand, right? Things like competition. This is what guides, the hidden hand that guides economic growth.